According to a new analysis by the Congressional Budget Office, President Trump's budget could increase federal deficit spending as much as $3.3 trillion over the next 10 years. That figure is causing friction on Capitol, with members of both parties sounding the political alarm on America's rising national debt, which now sits approximately $36 trillion and rising. With us now, New York Times bestselling author and founder of the Bridgewater Associates hedge fund, Ray Dalio. He's the author of the new book titled How Countries Go Broke, The Big Cycle, which looks at how mounting debt and four other major forces are putting the current geopolitical order in jeopardy. And Mr. Dalio, that's a political order, really, that's been in place since the end of World War II, and debt could be undermining that. Explain to us how.
The reason I wrote the book is that for about 50 years I've been in the markets betting on these things, and I wanted to convey the mechanics of how the process works. So think about it this way. The credit system is like the circulatory system, and that it brings buying power throughout the economy, and by creating credit, you create buying power, and that creates debt. But if that debt produces income, then that's a healthy system. If it doesn't, it produces interest rates and debt service that build up and crowd out spending. And so we can see that happening to the government. So now interest rates, for example, are now $1 trillion. So let me put the budget in perspective. That number that you gave is a wrong number, because it is the amount of deficit on top of the amount of deficit that would be there. $7 trillion is the amount the government spends every year. It takes in $5 trillion. As a result, it's got a $2 trillion deficit. And it works the same for governments as it works for individuals or companies, except the government can print money. And so that is building up. Over the next 10 years, it's going to increase by the debt, and the debt service is going to increase by more than 10 times that $2.5 trillion number, because that number was a number on top of the deficit. So what we're having is a crowding out, like in plaque building up in this system, a crowding out of spending. And that amount of debt now is about $230,000 per person. So you can see it happen in that way. In addition, you have supply-demand issues. In other words, one man's debts are another man's assets. And when there's a lot of more debt that's being sold, then you have a demand problem, not an adequate amount of demand. We're seeing this happen now as central banks and foreign investors are buying less and, in fact, shifting to gold. So there's that dynamic that I'm trying to convey the mechanics of. It's not political, and there's something we can do about that, what I call the 3% solution.
Right. And just to give our friends who are watching right now just a bit of perspective, when I left Congress, we had balanced budgets, we had surpluses, and we had a $5 trillion debt. And just to show this is not, like as you said, this is not a partisan issue, then a Republican president came in, the debt doubled to $10 trillion. Then a Democratic president came in, the debt doubled again to about $20 trillion. Then Donald Trump came in, the debt exploded. Joe Biden came in, the debt exploded. Both parties over the past 25 years have been extraordinarily reckless. We're now talking about adding another $20 trillion in the next decade. Could you explain to us, in writing How Countries Go Broke, how that could happen to the United States if we go from having a $37 trillion debt to a $57 trillion debt in a decade? That's not sustainable, is it?
No, and you could see it. Okay, if you understand the mechanics, you can actually see it. So you could see that this debt service has now crowding out spending. So you can see you can't cut spending very much, it's fixed. And that the interest continues to build up that way. And you, like plaque. So if I was a doctor looking at your circumstances, and I could show you that building up and I could show you that crowding out, you can also see the supply relative to the demand. And you could see the big imbalance. And then there's the big risk that not only is the supply of new supply a problem, but also those who are holding the bonds may not think they're going to get a good real return. If you study history and you see this, you would not want to hold those bonds expecting a good real return, and you could see selling. And so that dynamic is, you can see it mechanically. And you could also see that we are at the point in that cycle that the adding that debt from just this next year and the next 2 years will put us over the edge, could put us over the edge, very close to that, because you're now having the need to create debt in order to pay the debt. And so when you see these debt cycles, there are something like 50 of them looked at in this book. When you get that the debt is having to pay the debt, then what happens? You have the government come in and the central bank, and you have printing money. You're entirely right. From 1991 until 1998, they reduced the federal debt by 5% of GDP. We could cut the federal debt right now if it's done in a certain way, 3 ways. You can cut that down to 3% of GDP. You need a 3% of GDP. It's now going to be about 7% of GDP. If you can cut that down to 3% of GDP, then you change the supply demand, and you don't have that compounding effect. And there are 3 ways to do that, and they have to be balanced. The 3 ways are, of course, in spending and in and tax revenue. I'll emphasize revenue, and also then interest rates, because interest is such a big component of the debt. If there's lower interest rates, but you can't force those interest rates down, because bondholders won't want to hold it if they get a poor interest rate. But you have a situation where if you change the supply and demand, you will naturally have a lower interest rate. So we're at that point now.
Yeah, and Gene Robinson, you don't wave a magic wand or bully a Fed chief and say lower the interest rates, because then the bondholders flee. It reminds us all, and I know you remember this, when in Bill Clinton, early in Bill Clinton's term, as we were about to undergo a decade of deficit reduction, he was told by Alan Greenspan, you're not going to be able to allow the deficit to explode, or you're going to have people, bond traders, that are going to rebel and revolt against you, and interest rates are going to up, and it's going to be a terrible cycle. Bill Clinton said, you mean my whole damn presidency is going to be held hostage by bond traders? And Alan Greenspan basically said, yes, it is. Here we are again in 2025.
Well, that's it. Obviously, the interest rates are important, and discretionary spending, though, is relatively small compared to entitlement spending, and I wonder, Ray, if it is indeed possible, in your view, to get to your 3% without cutting Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, which I personally would have problems with, but politically, that is essentially a non-starter. So can you leave those programs alone and get to your 3%?
The way I do the numbers, I find if you could take it about a 4% cut in spending and a 4% improvement in tax revenue, that you would get enough of a decrease in the deficit that you would also naturally have about 100 basis points, maybe more, decrease in interest rates, and you'd get very close to that you have to, so you have to bring it in that order of magnitude. I'm not saying that that's easy, but it's a political question. When I go to Washington and I speak to people on both sides, everybody agrees with what I'm saying. I mean, meaning that you have to get it to 3% of GDP and so on. But it's political because it's like being on a boat headed to rocks. And on the boat, everybody agrees you have to turn. And they can't agree whether you turn left or you turn right, and they're going to go right into the rocks. And so it's a political question. I think the period from 1991 to 1998 that also Joe is referring to is a good model period to take a look at how to best do it and realize that the consequences of not doing it are disastrous.
Mm-hmm. And I will say, before I got to Washington in 1994, we were told it was impossible to do. I could give you one article after another article saying you couldn't balance the budget. Now, well, you can't do it overnight, but we have to move in that direction because we are going toward the rocks, as he said. And the question's not whether we do it, it's how we're going to do it. We have to do it. And there is no other choice. In this book, this should be must reading for every member of Congress, everybody in the administration, everybody who wants to understand how important this issue is.
The new book, How Countries Go Broke, The Big Cycle, is available now. Best-selling author and investor Ray Dalio, thank you very much for coming on the show this morning.
Ray, thank you so much.